If you look at the bottom of your phone, your shoes, or the mug you're drinking from right now, they all have one thing in common. No, not that they are secretly judging your life choices. They were all made in China. We've all just accepted this as a fundamental law of the universe, right alongside gravity and the fact that the line at the DMV will always outlive you. It's a cliché at this point. China is the world's factory. But when you actually stop and think about it, it is completely, mathematically insane that a single country on Earth makes basically everything for everyone. Why not India? Why not Brazil? Why not, I don't know, Liechtenstein? How did one nation become the absolute undisputed heavyweight champion of making your cheap plastic garbage, your highly expensive titanium smartphones, and literally everything in between? To understand this, we have to go back to 1978. Before then, China wasn't exactly an economic powerhouse. It was largely agrarian, isolated, and incredibly poor. But then the government, led by Deng Xiaoping, looked around, realized they had 1 billion people who needed jobs, and decided to open up to the rest of the world. They created these things called special economic zones. Basically, they took 4 coastal cities, drew an imaginary line around them, and said, inside this circle, foreign companies can come build factories, pay very low taxes, and engage in capitalism. And the world's corporations, who love nothing more than low taxes and cheap labor, tripped over themselves rushing in. Now, this is usually where the explanation stops. People say, oh, China had really cheap labor, so everyone went there. And sure, in 1985, paying someone fractions of a cent an hour to glue sneakers together was an incredible deal for an executive sitting in a corner office in Chicago. Except, here is the problem with the cheap labor argument. Today, Chinese labor isn't actually that cheap anymore. In fact, if you just want pure, bottom-of-the-barrel, cheapest possible human labor, you shouldn't be in China at all. You should be in Vietnam, or Bangladesh, or Ethiopia, or Madagascar. Over the last 2 decades, Chinese wages have steadily skyrocketed. A factory worker in Shenzhen now makes significantly more than a factory worker in Hanoi. So, logically, every corporation in the world should have packed up their bags, put their sewing machines on a boat, and moved to cheaper countries years ago. But they didn't. Apple still makes the vast majority of iPhones in China. Tesla built a massive gigafactory in Shanghai. The world stayed. Which brings us to the actual secret of why everything is made in China. It's not the cheap labor. It's the ecosystem. Economists call this agglomeration. I call it the making a sandwich rule. Imagine you want to make a really good turkey sandwich, but you live in a town where the bakery is 3 hours north, the turkey farm is 4 hours south, the mayonnaise factory is in another country, and the guy who knows how to slice cheese is currently on a 2-week vacation. Making that sandwich is going to take you weeks, it's going to cost a fortune in shipping, and the bread will be stale by the time you eat it. Now imagine you move to a town where the baker, the butcher, the cheese guy, and the mayonnaise enthusiast all live in the exact same apartment building. You can build a sandwich in 5 minutes. That is China. Specifically, that is the Pearl River Delta and cities like Shenzhen. If you are a tech company in California and you want to invent a new smart toaster, you don't just need an assembly line. You need custom screws. You need a specific gauge of copper wire. You need injection mold plastic. You need microchips. If you build your factory in the US, you have to order the screws from Ohio, the plastic from Texas, the microchips from Taiwan. If you realize halfway through that the screws are 1 millimeter too long, you have to halt production, call Ohio, wait 6 weeks for a new shipment, and lose millions of dollars. But if you are in Shenzhen, the guy making the screws is literally next door to your factory. The plastic injection molding plant is across the street. The microchip vendor is in a massive, 10-story electronics market downtown. If your screw is a millimeter too long, you walk next door, yell at the screw guy, and he retools his machines and brings you new screws by lunchtime. You cannot beat that level of speed. It is a completely self-contained, perfectly optimized, terrifyingly efficient web of suppliers, sub-suppliers, and sub-sub-suppliers. You aren't just hiring a factory, you are plugging into an entire hardware nervous system. And holding all of this together is infrastructure that makes the rest of the world look like it's operating in the Stone Age. You can have the best factories on Earth, but if you can't get the stuff onto a boat, it doesn't matter. The Chinese government has spent the last 30 years pouring trillions of dollars into building the most absurdly massive network of highways, high-speed rail, and deep-water ports ever conceived by humanity. 7 of the 10 busiest container ports in the world are in China. They can churn out 4 million rubber ducks and have them loaded onto a cargo ship bound for Los Angeles before you've even finished your morning coffee. Speaking of things desperately trying to survive against all odds, please subscribe to this almost dead YouTube channel before the algorithm finally pulls my life support. Okay, back to the global supply chain. So, China has the ecosystem, they have the ports, and they have the experience. End of story, right? We just keep buying Chinese stuff until the sun explodes. Well, here is the twist. China actually wants to stop making your stuff. Wait, what? Yes. The Chinese government has looked at their economy, and they've realized they are falling into something called the middle-income trap. Making cheap plastic toys and assembling phones for American companies is a great way to take a country from being very poor to being moderately wealthy. But it is a terrible way to become a global superpower. Why? Because the margins on assembling an iPhone are razor-thin. Apple takes all the profit because they designed the phone. The factory in China just gets the absolute bare minimum for screwing it together. China doesn't want to be the guy screwing the phone together anymore. They want to be Apple. So, the government launched an initiative called Made in China 2025. The goal is essentially to forcefully yank their entire economy up the value chain. They are aggressively moving away from low-end, cheap manufacturing and pivoting incredibly hard into high-tech. They want to lead the world in artificial intelligence, robotics, aerospace, semiconductors, and green energy. And it is working. Right now, China absolutely dominates the global supply chain for electric vehicles. They dominate solar panel manufacturing. They refine almost all of the world's rare earth metals that go into batteries. They aren't just assembling foreign tech anymore, they are inventing the tech that the rest of the world is going to rely on for the next 50 years. But wait, if China is abandoning cheap manufacturing to build robots and electric cars, who is going to make all our cheap t-shirts and plastic spatulas? The answer is China. Just not in China. In one of the most ironic twists in modern economic history, China has become so expensive and so advanced that Chinese companies are now outsourcing their own cheap manufacturing to other countries. Chinese textile companies are building massive factories in Vietnam and Bangladesh. Chinese electronics firms are setting up assembly plants in Mexico and parts of Africa. They are doing exactly what the United States did to them 30 years ago. China is outsourcing being China. Meanwhile, Western companies are getting a little nervous about having literally all of their eggs in one giant, politically complicated Chinese basket. A global pandemic and a few trade wars made executives realize that maybe relying on a single country for the entirety of global commerce was a slightly risky business strategy. So now we have something called the China Plus One strategy. Companies like Apple and Samsung are keeping their main hubs in China, but they are slowly, painstakingly trying to build backup factories in places like India or Vietnam. Just in case. But replacing China is like trying to drain the ocean with a slotted spoon. You can move an assembly plant to India, but if that Indian plant still has to import all of its screws, wires, and microchips from Shenzhen, you haven't actually escaped China. You've just added a really long, annoying shipping route to your supply chain. The reality is, the ecosystem that China built over the last 40 years is the most complex logistical machine ever created by human beings. It is impossible to replicate overnight, and it might be impossible to replicate ever. So, the world's factory isn't closing down. It's just remodeling. The days of China being the undisputed king of cheap, disposable junk are slowly coming to an end. But they are being replaced by an era where China is the undisputed king of high-tech infrastructure, green energy, and advanced manufacturing. So the next time you turn over a piece of cheap plastic junk and see "Made in China," cherish it. Because pretty soon, the only thing they'll be making for us is the robot that replaces your job.